Do you have any comments? No? Okay, well, hey, welcome back to this bootcamp series. In this video, we're going to learn about something called webpack. Do you know what webpack is? No. Now, a lot of people are intimidated by webpack, and so they avoid ever really understanding it. Now, before we even jump into what webpack is, I just want to say that technically you can get by with using it without ever understanding it. So you can just copy and paste an existing configuration file for webpack and be up and running. However, I don't think that's a great idea. I think it makes more sense to actually take a little bit of time to understand webpack. I think this will give you a sense of calmness and confidence because in the modern web development world, we're going to run into webpack again and again and again. And being able to customize it or troubleshoot it or adjust it to fit our needs is a huge strength. Anyways, without further ado, let's jump into the action and get started with webpack. Okay, so what exactly is webpack and why is it necessary? Well, in our previous video, when we were running Node on our personal computer, it was very easy to load or require in either community-created packages or separate JavaScript files that we created as separate files just to stay organized. The point is that it was a piece of cake to pull in other separate files because Node was running on our computer, so obviously Node had easy access to those files. However, what about client-side JavaScript, where we want to deliver our JavaScript to visitors of a website that we build? In that situation, we can't just mention the name of a package from NPM and expect it to magically be available to our visitors. Right? They don't have access to the Node modules folder on our personal computer. So this is where webpack comes into play. Webpack can bundle or pack together all of our different separate files and dependencies so that they're easy to deliver to the visitors of our websites. Now don't worry, if me just explaining it in words doesn't make sense, that's okay, that's to be expected. So from this point forward, let's go ahead and get our hands dirty and actually start trying to use webpack. So right now, do this with me, jump into VS Code, and I want you to open up or create a brand new empty folder. So you can see on my desktop, I have this new empty folder named Learn Webpack. The name doesn't matter, but with a new folder in VS Code, let's go ahead and create our package.json file. If you have no idea what that is, that's okay. You can just go back and watch the very previous video here on my YouTube channel. But essentially, if we open up our command line that's pointing towards our desired empty folder, again, you can press Control-J or Command-J to toggle your command line. Let's just run npm init-y. So that will create our package.json file. And now we can start installing packages. So to start using webpack, we just need to install two packages. So run this command with me. npm install. The first package is just webpack, and then a space. The second package we want is called webpack-cli. Okay, let's go ahead and push enter. Be patient to download those files. It might take 30-40 seconds. Okay, but once it does finish, what do we want to do next? Well, let's start actually writing or creating our JavaScript. So within the root of the project folder that we have opened in VS Code, I need you to create a new folder. So I'm just going to right-click New Folder, or you can use this little icon up here, but create a new folder with me, and it needs to have this exact name. It needs to be named src for source. We need to give it this exact folder name because this is where webpack by default is going to look for our source code. Now don't worry, a bit later on in this lesson we can learn how to tell webpack exactly wherever we want it to look. We can configure webpack. But for now, let's just use the webpack default location. So it's going to look inside a src folder for a file named index.js. So inside this folder, say new file and name it index.js. Again, these locations are all customizable 100%, but we're just sticking with the webpack defaults for now. Okay, now in this new empty file, let's imagine we want to validate if a string of text is an email address or not. Now, as we saw in our previous video, we know that there's a package on NPM called validator. So imagine we want to use that. In the command line, we could just say npm install, and the name of the package is validator. Okay, so now with that installed, in our new empty index.js file, we can just say const validator equals require, point towards the validator package. Okay, and then on a new line of code, let's actually use it. So we can just say console.log, and imagine we want to log out. So validator dot, it has a method of is email, and just give it a string of text. So this would return false, or if you made it look like an actual email address, this should return true. So I'll just say this. So this should be false. Let's go ahead and save this. But now here's the interesting question, and here's the entire point of Webpack. So imagine we want this to be client-side JavaScript that runs in the web browser of a visitor on our website. So you and I, on our personal computers, we have access to the validator package from NPM, right? We know it lives in our node modules folder, but the visitors of our website don't have a node modules folder. So we need some sort of way to bundle up or package up all of our dependencies. Or in other words, we just need to tell Webpack to do its job. Now this is super easy because we're using the default folder location of source or src, and we named our file index.js. Literally, all we need to do is go into the command line and say npx. npx is a super useful command or tool to execute a certain package. So remember in our previous video when we had our file of test.js and it was a bit of node code, you and I were writing node and then the name of the file, right? Well, in this case, we don't have any node code ourselves that we want to execute or run, but we just want to use or run the Webpack package. So if we say npx, and then you can give it a package name. If you don't already have it installed, it will try to download it from the internet from NPM. In our case, we already installed Webpack, so this should be lightning fast. We just say npx Webpack, and that's it. Let's press enter. Now don't worry, for now we can absolutely ignore this warning message. However, notice that that created a brand new folder named dist. And inside it, it created a file named main.js. This is our bundled up file that Webpack generated for us. And no matter how many different separate files we used in our code or how many different packages from NPM we import, Webpack bundles it all together in this one convenient file that we can have our visitors download. So if we want to really test this out, let's maybe create an HTML file really quick and load it. Now in the real world, you wouldn't create a source HTML file in your dist folder, but for now, this is perfectly fine. Just right click on the dist folder and let's say new file. Let's call it index.html. Inside this file, we can just hit doc and then hit tab for a skeleton. And then right before the closing body tag, let's say script and then hit tab. Give the opening tag a source and just point towards main.js, right? That file that Webpack automatically created for us. Above that, maybe we want a heading level 1 that says hello and welcome. And then maybe below that, we want a paragraph with a little bit of lorem ipsum. Okay, let's save this, and now let's open this file in our web browser. So I'm just going to drag and drop that index.html file in my dist folder. I'm just going to drag it on top of Chrome. Okay, there we see the basic HTML, but what we really want to see is the console. Remember, in our file, we were logging to the console whether this email address or whether this string of text is a valid email or not. So if I check the console in my browser, cool, we see false. However, if we change this to john@test.com and hit save, that should be a valid email address now, so we would expect to see true. We do need to bundle up our code again, so in the command line, just run npx to execute a package. So npx webpack, hit enter. That's going to rebundle up. It should only take a couple of seconds. Back in the browser, if we refresh, perfect, we see true. Now before we move on and learn more about webpack, I do want to go off on a tiny bit of a tangent, and that is that you saw me just use this require syntax to load in this validator package. I used this because we're already familiar with using require from our previous video when we were writing Node code. So this is the default or traditional way to import a package in Node. However, in the latest versions of JavaScript itself, or ECMAScript, there is now a native way to import a package or a file or a module. So I do want to show you the more modern syntax. As of today, this would not work in the Node environment out of the box without a bit of configuration, but it absolutely will work in this newest version of Webpack. So we can just say import validator from, and then a string of text and just the package name. So if we hit save, and then we can package it up again, so npx webpack, refresh in the browser, and it still works. Perfect. Really quick, why don't we practice creating our own separate file, maybe a function called double me or triple me, and practice importing that. So for example, let's also log to the console triple me and give it a value of 10. So we would expect this to return a value of 30. Now at the moment, we don't have this function, so let's actually go create a triple me function in an entirely separate file. So within our source folder, let's say new file. Let's name it tripleme.js. Inside this file, let's just say function triple me parentheses curly brackets. Let's have one parameter to receive the incoming number, and then just return that asterisk or multiply 3. Now at the very bottom of this file, in our previous video, when you're using the require syntax to import and export, we would have said module.exports equals triple me. However, if we're using the JavaScript or ECMAScript native way of importing and exporting, instead we would say export default whatever you want to export. So in this case, triple me. So we can save that. Now back in our main file, before we use it right here, let's import it up at the top. So you just say import triple me from a path, right? So quotes dot slash to look in the current folder, triple me. Let's go ahead and save that, and now tell Webpack to bundle up our code again. So in the command line, npx webpack. Give that a couple of seconds, refresh in the browser. Perfect. We see 30. Now, if you're anything like me, at this point, you're probably sick and tired of having to manually run npx webpack every time we want to rebundle our changes. Well, to get around that, in the command line, we can instead just say npx webpack, and then a space, dash dash, so 2 dashes, watch. Okay, with the watch option like this, now if we press enter, not only does that run a task, but it never actually finishes. That task is still running and it's just watching and waiting. So if I change the triple me number to 20 and hit save, back in the browser if I refresh, you can see it's already 60. So now you can change this as many times as you want. Webpack is just running in the background continuously, watching our code for changes. Anytime it detects a saved change, it's going to rebundle. Okay, now changing gears to a new topic. When we're writing client-side JavaScript like this, we do want to pay attention to the file size of our bundled file. So for example, in the dist folder, if you right-click on the main.js file that Webpack is creating for us, and then you can either click properties or get info, you can see that it's already 74 kilobytes and we really haven't done anything yet. This is because we imported the entirety of the validator package from NPM. Now, whenever you import a package that you're going to force the visitors of your website to download, you do want to be mindful of the file size. So a better approach, if we know that we're only going to use this one feature of isEmail, right, that one method from the validator package, instead we can say import validator /lib/isEmail. From the individual NPM documentation page for a package, it will usually spell out the exact text that you would use here to import just one method. But now maybe let's change the variable name here to is email. And then that's what we would use down here. So get rid of the validator dot and just directly use is email here. So if we save that, Webpack is still watching us. It's going to rebundle up. And now you can see instead of 74 kilobytes, our bundled up file that the visitors of our website have to download, now it's only 8 kilobytes. Now right now when we're just getting started with Webpack, I don't want you to obsess on the file size. You can worry about that down the road, but this is something that I want to be on your radar. Okay, at this point, let's jump back to actually learning about Webpack itself. So now that we've used the default folder location of src and the default file name of index.js, you're probably wondering, what if we don't want to use those folders and file names? What if we want to use our own custom values? Well, you absolutely can. We can configure Webpack however we want. So to stop the current watch task, in the command line, you can just press Control-C. Right? That way Webpack doesn't just sit there and watch us endlessly. Okay, and let's learn how to start configuring Webpack. So in the root of our project folder, we just want to create a new file, and it needs to have this exact name, webpack.config.js. Okay, now in this new empty file, we say module.exports equals curly brackets, right, an object. And now inside this object, we give Webpack different properties and values, and we can tell it to do whatever we want it to do. So for example, imagine instead of our source code living in this folder named src, what if we wanted this folder to be able to be named app or anything else for that matter? But just so you and I are on the same page, why don't we rename our source folder to just app. Okay, and then also imagine, what if instead of our main file being named index.js, what if we wanted it to be named maybe just app.js? So for example, let's rename it. You could name it anything, right? But just so we're on the same page, let's call it app.js. Okay, so now in this configuration file, we would just say entry, we give it a property of entry, quotes, // for the current folder, then we would look inside the app folder, and then we want the file named app.js. So we're just telling Webpack this is the entry into our application, or this is the beginning of what we want you to start parsing and bundling up the dependencies for. Okay, next, what if we wanted to control where the bundled file gets output? Now I actually like the folder name of dist, but you could use a different folder name if you wanted to, but let's try customizing the name of the generated file. So let's actually delete main.js. And imagine instead we want Webpack to generate a file named mybundle. So in this object, let's just add a comma at the end of this line. Let's have another property named output, : this is actually an object itself with multiple properties. So we give it one property of file name, : and let's call it quotes mybundle.js. You could name it anything you want. That's just what I'm choosing as an example. Comma, another property of path. So now this is where you could point towards any custom output folder. I'm just going to stick with the dist folder though. Now Webpack actually needs an absolute path to the folder here. So instead of just spelling out a directory like this, we do need to do something a little bit different for the output path here. So up at the very top of our file, let's import a core part of Node called path. So we can just say const path equals require in path. So remember in our previous video when we required in the fs module, that was just a built-in part of Node itself. Well, path is also a built-in part of Node. So now down here for this path property, we can just say path and then call a method it has named resolve. Let's say __, so two of them, and then dir name. So that will give us the current folder that we're in right now at the moment, and then comma, and then we can just spell out whatever actual folder name you want to output to. So I'm going to stick with dist, but you could change this. Okay, but let's go ahead and save this configuration file and test it out. So remember, we changed our source folder to be named app. We changed the name of our main file to app.js. And now our dist folder, we're hoping to see a new file named mybundle in it. So in the command line, just run npx webpack, push enter. Cool. In dist, I now see mybundle.js. We can test it out to make sure it's working. Back in our HTML file, just change what file name we're looking for here. So instead of main.js, it would be mybundle. Give that a save. Back in the browser, refresh. Cool. It's still working perfectly. Also, if we don't want to have to remember to include --watch in order to have Webpack watch us ongoing, instead, in our config file, maybe right after this output, we can just say comma and have another property, watch, and just set it to true. So now if we run down in the command line, npx webpack, well, just like before, now it's just going to continue running until we tell it to stop. So if I change this to 500, hit save, back in the browser, reload, it's going to automatically rebundle after every saved change. Now that watch ability is great, it's very convenient, but wouldn't it be even more convenient if Webpack could reload the browser for us, right? If we didn't need to manually hit Command R or F5 to reload our browser. Well, not only can Webpack do that and refresh the browser for us, it can go one step further, and instead of even needing to reload the browser, it can just inject or replace the newest version of our JavaScript into the browser in memory without even reloading. Now, in order to make any of the things I just described possible, we do need to install something called Webpack devServer. Now, this is going to be the final topic in this video, and I do want to point out that this is entirely optional. You do not need to use the devServer. However, it can speed up development, and it is pretty luxurious to just have your newest code always in the browser without even reloading at all. Anyways, let me show you how we can set this up. So in the command line, let's press Control-C to tell Webpack to stop watching us. Okay, and the package we need to install, so npm install, the name of the package is webpack-dev-server. Okay, go ahead and press enter. Okay, now let me show you how we use this. So back in our config file, let's get rid of the watch true. That's no longer necessary if we're going to have a dev server. So just a new property in our config object and call it, it needs to be named dev server, uppercase S, colon. This receives an object itself. Inside that object, we give it a few different properties. So first of all, let's tell it which port on our computer to run on. So port, let's try 8080. If this doesn't work, you could try a value of 3000 or 4000, but let's go with 8080. I'll show you where this number comes into play in just a moment. Comma, and then let's also tell it which folder to use as the base for our dev server preview. So why don't we just use our dist folder, right? That's what contains our web page, our index.html, and that's what contains our bundled file. So we give it a property of content base, colon, and then let's use path resolve again to give it an absolute path. So path.resolve __ dir name, comma, dist. Okay, and then on a slightly unrelated note, to stop seeing that warning message in the console about being in production mode, we can just add a comma and say mode development. So if instead we set this to production, that's for the live version of our website, not us while we're developing for our own convenience. So production is going to minify the file and use short variable names, remove all white space, basically make the bundled file be as small as possible so it's quick to download. However, compressing it like that does probably add a few 100 milliseconds or longer, and also removes potentially really valuable debugging information for us while we're developing the site. So when we're not ready to actually deliver our files to the public yet, let's set this to development. Right? This way it's optimized for us while we're developing the site. So let's go ahead and save this. And now this might seem confusing at first, but I actually want you to delete the bundled file in our dist folder. So I'm going to delete my bundle.js. The reason I'm doing this is because Webpack devServer by default doesn't actually output the bundled file to your hard drive. Instead, it just makes this file name available in memory. This allows it to be even faster in between bundles every time we save. It can just store the contents of the file in memory, which is always going to be way faster than actually saving to a hard drive. So with this file saved, let's test it out. In the command line, we just run npx webpack-dev-server. Go ahead and press enter. Okay, now this is why they call it Webpack devServer. Instead of visiting the local HTML file on our hard drive, we actually want to visit a different address. So up in the address bar, I want you to visit localhost:8080, right? Because that's the port number we chose. Cool, now you can see the website looks exactly the same, and if we view the console, we see those same values, the true and the triple me value. However, check this out. If we make a change to our main JavaScript file, right? If I change this number to 1000 and hit save, notice back in the browser, I don't even need to hit refresh or reload. Webpack just automatically reloads for me. Also, if we look in our dist folder, we don't actually see that file named mybundle.js. However, up in the address bar, if you visit localhost:8080/mybundle.js, you can see it. That file absolutely exists in memory and is available from this URL, but Webpack isn't writing it to the hard drive, and this allows Webpack to be even faster. So this is perfect when we're developing our site and we're going to be saving changes hundreds of times and testing and debugging in the browser. And then when it comes time to actually generate that bundled file, well, you can just tell this command to stop watching us, tell the dev server to stop running, I should say. So press Control-C. And then when you actually want to bundle your files so that a file does actually live on our hard drive in the dist folder, you could just run npx webpack instead of webpack devserver. So when I run that, cool, that actually does save the file to the hard drive. But we don't need that for right now, so I'm going to delete that. Okay, now before we bring this lesson to a close, I want to show you a superpower that Webpack has. So at the moment, if I start up that dev server again, npx webpack devserver, yes, it will reload the browser for me every time I save a change. So if I put this to 2000, hit save, it is going to reload the browser for me. So in the console, I see 6,000. If I change this to 5,000, in the console, we see 15,000. You get the idea. However, it's still reloading and refreshing the browser. Right? You can prove this by if I select or highlight content on the page and then just make any change here. So if I put this to a value of 2, hit save, notice it refreshed the entire browser and it lost my selection of text. Now there's nothing horribly wrong about that, but we can make this even faster if we adjust it so that instead of having to reload, the browser just gets injected on the fly with the newest copy of our JavaScript. This will give us the fastest possible performance and experience while developing. So to set this up, let's go ahead and hit Control-C in the command line to tell the current task to stop running. And in our config file, within devServer, we just need to give it another property in addition to port and content base. So let me add a comma here and just say hot, and set it to true. Let's go ahead and save that file. So this is going to enable something called hot module replacement in Webpack. So with this in place, we're just one step away from having the blazing fast performance. Now in our main JavaScript file, right, the file that is the entry point into our app. So for us, that's this app.js file. At the very bottom, just type this out with me. If, so just an if statement, the condition is if module.hot, curly brackets, what do we want to do if that's true? Basically meaning what do we want to do if the hot feature is running and this is a dev server, not the live version of our website? If it's true, then just say module.hot, call a method of accept. Essentially, if this feature is enabled, then accept the newest updates of the file. So let's save this and test it out. It's pretty cool. So in the command line, we can just run npx webpack devserver. Okay, now check this out. So you might need to refresh just the initial first time on localhost 8080, but now after that, we don't need to ever refresh again. So if we check the console, we see those values of true and 6. And if we go back into app.js and change this number to 10, hit save. Yes, in the console, if we scroll down, we do see that got tripled to 30. But now to really prove that it's not even reloading the browser and it's just always injecting the code into memory, check this out. If you just select a bit of text on the page, now obviously if you manually hit refresh, you lose your selection, right? So this is how we can test that the browser is not even reloading. If you just select that and change this to just a different value, hit save, notice that didn't even unselect my selection. But if you check the console, we do see the latest value. This may not seem like a big deal, but when you start doing more advanced things in the browser, it can be really nice, not only from a speed and performance standpoint, but also you don't lose any of the values in the browser's memory. You don't lose the current state of the web page. It can just be very handy to inject the latest code without a reload. So really quick, just to test this out again, now if we select this paragraph, maybe we could write a little bit of JavaScript that changes the value of this headline. So back in app.js, just as a quick test, I'll even move this window down so we can see the browser in the background. But if I say document.query selector and just select the heading level 1 and say inner text should equal hello. If I hit save, notice in the background that got updated in real time and the browser didn't even reload. We didn't even lose the selection of this text. So you can see how for development and debugging, this is just incredibly fast. Now don't worry, that was the last real feature I wanted to show you in this video. But before we bring this video to a close, I do want to show you perhaps a more elegant way of calling our commands. So there's nothing wrong if I press Ctrl+C to stop that current task. There's nothing wrong with using npx and then either webpack devserver or just webpack. However, maybe you don't want to have to remember that name of webpack-devserver. Maybe you don't even want to have to remember the name of webpack. Instead, maybe it would be nice if we could just say npm run dev whenever we wanted the dev server to start, and maybe we could just say npm run build whenever we wanted the regular webpack task to run that actually saves the file to the hard drive. So really quick at the end here, this doesn't have anything to do with webpack, this just has something to do with npm itself. I want to show you how we can create our own NPM scripts so that we can run commands like this. So to do this, we're just going to jump into our package.json file. Okay, in this file, this is the same file that keeps a list of our dependencies, but there's also a property named scripts. By default, there's just this one named test, but right above test, so within the scripts object, let's say quotes, and now we can make up any name for our command. We could call it pizza or unicorn or anything, but why don't we call one of ours dev? So colon and then quotes. After the quotes, be sure to include a comma here. And now this is just the actual command that we would have typed in the command line. So let's just say webpack-devserver. Okay, and then let's have another task named build. So on a new line here, quotes build colon quotes. Be sure to include the comma here. In the quotes, just say webpack. So now whenever we want to run this task, we don't need to remember webpack-devserver. We can literally just say npm run dev. And then when we want to actually build our file and save it out to the hard drive, we don't need to remember webpack, even though that's not that hard to remember. We can just say npm run build. So be sure to save this file. And then one quick note, back in our config file, I'm actually going to get rid of this mode line completely, and I'll get rid of this trailing comma here too. Save that. This way, when we run our dev server command, the mode can default to development, and when we run our build task, it can default to production. Don't worry, in a future lesson, I'll show you how to use conditional values depending on the current task that's running. But for now, this should work fairly nicely. So to test it out, in the command line now, if we want to start up our dev server, we can just say npm run, and then the name of the script that we created in our package.json file. So we called it dev, so just npm run dev, hit enter. Cool, so I can still refresh and visit localhost 8080. Perfect, let me stop that task. Okay, and then remember I deleted the actual bundle file that lived in my hard drive and dist. So let's test that out actually generating it. We can just say npm run build. Push enter, and because that's using webpack instead of webpack devServer, it knows to actually generate it onto the hard drive. So now we see it, mybundle.js, and you're free to use that anywhere you would normally use a JavaScript file for the general public to download. Cool, and that is going to bring the technical aspect of this video to a close. Congrats on making it to the end of this video. Now let's talk about where we go from here. So let's actually get back to the task at hand. Remember, a lesson or two ago, we were working with React, and we needed a way to automatically transpile our JSX into traditional JavaScript. Well, now that we understand what Webpack is, what Webpack can do for us, and the basics of getting up and running, it's going to be a piece of cake to get it to transpile our JSX for us. And as you might have guessed, that's exactly what we're finally going to set up in our next video. If you're enjoying this bootcamp series so far, as always, I'd appreciate it if you shared the link with your friends and family. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.